I read in one of the Sunday papers a comment by an American, I can't remember his name, he's an economist, but he said that the rise of Donald Trump is proof that we've now reached a post-factual age. Facts mean nothing anymore. There's no absolute truth in anything. So all that leaves us is the power of the stories we tell. And I don't think we should be worried about that, because storytelling is the most powerful and the oldest way of communicating ideas. And I think we can use it, because our stories are so powerful, I think we can use it to great effect. And that's what I want to talk about today. Just to amplify this point, I don't know how many of you remember this report. It came out about 8 or 9 years ago. Is anyone familiar with it? You put your hand up if you're familiar with it. Thank you very much. So most of you don't know about it. Well, that's not a surprise to me. This is actually a major report funded by the World Bank. It used 400 scientists and experts around the world, and they looked at how agricultural technologies how effective they were going to be at feeding the planet. It was a major report, and came out in 2008, and it said unequivocally the way ahead has got to be ecological. Agroecology is the way to feed the world. And it's been airbrushed from history. And the reason is because it didn't come up with the right answers. There was a group of very powerful people that wanted everyone to believe that technology was the way we were going to feed the world. And so this report was removed. It was given no publicity, and our government quickly commissioned another report, got the chief scientist, Sir John Beddington, to write another report. This was called the Foresight Report, and everyone went around, the whole of the government went around promoting that report. And that left the door open for GM crops and everything, all the other technologies. So I kind of agree that the age of facts, they don't mean anything to anybody, and the ones that do come out are the ones that in somebody's commercial interest to come out. So that's where I started writing stories there a long time ago, and I quickly realized that those are the kind of stories they wanted about these things. And in those days, I don't know if it's true today, but in those days, the perfect introductory paragraph to a Farmer's Weekly story would mention profit, would mention new or innovative. And if you get pounds, as in pounds sterling in the first paragraph, that was considered an excellent news story. But I want to go back much earlier, because our stories begin even before that. Our stories begin with hunter-gatherers, and there was an interesting piece of news recently about a site quite near Stonehenge where they found a dog, the bones of a dog, and they worked out from its DNA analysis that the dog had come from York. And the supposition was that people gathered in this area on Salisbury Plain, and it was very rich in game, particularly wild cattle, aurochs, and they used to come there seasonally to hunt, and also for feasting. So that was, that's how old the grass-fed meat is, and grassland being used to produce our food. And from that, we had the Neolithic farmers, who were the first cattle herders, who actually moved their cattle and their sheep across the grasslands of southern England. Where they cleared forests, they exposed the grassland, and that produced their primary food source. So it was kind of an unbroken connection from the hunter-gatherers to the nomadic herders, if you like. I put this slide up to moving ahead to the time of the wool trade, where in the 13th and 14th century, every fell side in England would have had sheep. It was the first great global commodity, producing wool, and Britain or our hills were the best at it, and some of the best producers of wool were the Cistercian monks. And that wool went to Flanders, and it went to Italy. It was this area was the hub of this global trade. And again, it was grassland that built the wealth of Britain. That's a kind of Downton type picture. That's actually Croom Park. And it was the first, and it was the greatest love of Capability Brown and the amazing English landscape of grass. And it's an amazing place. It fell from, it sort of fell into disuse in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of that land was planted with cereals, and of course everything went downhill. Now National Trust have got it, and it's aesthetically it's very beautiful because you've got all these vistas looking across oceans of grass. But what's I think very exciting is now there's a chap called Rob Havard who's doing mob grazing on it. He's rented 200 acres. And he's actually developing a system of farming which is going to be incredibly productive and incredibly rewarding for the farmer. He talks about doing his farming in an hour a day, and it's basically moving these cattle on. And when he's tweaking the system, when he gets it right, he says he'll be able to make the kind of money from that land that he could at least as good as high input cereal growing and a lot more reliable. Now we're into the age of mixed farming. And I sometimes show this slide first and I say, you know, we're all being told by the government that we have to have more productive farming system. We've actually got to produce more from less. We've got to be innovative. Well, we have an amazingly productive farming system, that's it. It was painted in 1750 and it's in North Essex. It's a classic picture. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, they're both, well, he's the son of a banker and she's the daughter of a banker. So, you know, some things don't change, I guess. But Gainsborough wanted to paint landscapes, but he had to do what he called face pictures, because that made him the money. So he posed for Mr. and Mrs. Andrews out on their estate. And actually, if you look at the original, it's squashed up by my picture. But if you look at the original, there's more landscape than there is of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And what's interesting, in 1750, he's obviously a very modern type of farmer, because you can see the lines of the corn stubble. So he's using corn drill. And but behind, I don't know if you can see it, there's a field of grazing sheep, and on the left there's some grazing animals in an orchard. And I've got as close as I could to the real picture without setting the alarms off, and I can't work out whether they're actually cattle or deer in the orchard, but it doesn't matter because they're grazing animals. And that was the great engine of productivity, and that was the great leap forward in agricultural production in Britain, this idea you could integrate grassland and grazing in the rotation. And it led to a huge output. In fact, it produced a huge amount of food just when the population was growing. And that first picture was painted in 1750, and it's North Essex, just by the Suffolk border. This is an aerial photograph taken of the same area in 1940. This was taken by the Luftwaffe, by a German bomber, when Hitler was thinking of invading Britain. You know, they photographed much of southern England, looking obviously for military sites. But it's a beautiful snapshot. These pictures still exist, and beautiful, clear snapshots of what the countryside looked like in 1940. And there's a lovely book by Oliver Rackham, which some of you will know. It's called The Story of the Countryside, History of the Countryside. And he says almost every feature, if you go outside the towns, almost every feature in the countryside would have been recognizable to Sir Thomas More, and some of it even to the Emperor Claudius. That's how little the countryside had changed. So between 1750 and 1940, it hadn't changed at all. And there's a reason for that. It's because it produced good food in ways that were totally sustainable. In fact, when I was a student, you know, one of the elder statesmen in the science world was Sir George Stapledon, who was the leading agricultural scientist of his time. And he promoted, well, lay farming, as he called it, which was kind of, it was mixed farming, basically, based on short-term lays. And he said the mixed farm is the obvious type of farming for Britain because it has three characteristics. The farmer is self-sustainable, self-reliant, independent. So he didn't need to buy anything. It maintained fertility and it was flexible. And yet we've abandoned that. In my adult lifetime, we've abandoned it. And what made all those systems so productive, you know, going back 5,000 years was this. And it was this amazing process of cycling carbon, really, through the plant, into the soil, back to the plant, and then the animal being part of that harvesting of that vegetation and part of the carbon cycling. This is a picture I took at home. I'm the organiser, I'm glad to see, called me a farmer. Well, I've got 3 acres. I've got 3 acres at a house on Exmoor, and it's land that's so steep, it's just grassland that no one's ever been brave enough to go on with a tractor, and that's the kind of thing that grows on it. And if you went back not many years, all of Exmoor grazing would have been like that. And the traditional way to produce meat and milk and beef on Exmoor was with Devon cattle or Exmoor horn sheep, and to run them on pastures like that, and very little else. And so everybody was producing wonderful food in ways that cost them nothing. Apart from their labour, there were no other inputs, and it was sustainable. It went on year after year, decade after decade. And somehow we've taken all that away. And this is a kind of modern version of it. That's in the Cotswolds. And you know what that's about. It's mob grazing. Just about where I live on Exmoor, it had, what I wanted to say is about, our inheritance of an amazing system of farming. On Exmoor, where I live, there was a writer at the time called H.J. Massingham who wrote of a wartime visit to the area I live in. And he spoke of the amazing productivity of those small farmers who, with nothing and very little money, actually produced copious amounts of food. And they were part of feeding Britain through the war. And there were about 1 million small farmers in Britain at that time. And at the end of the war, the bureaucrats and the economists and the academics spoke of the small farm problem. And those small farmers who were producing food in these amazing ways had survived, not only survived, they profited through the years of the Depression. And when the war came, they were able to increase their production and help feed the nation. And at the end of the war, they were described by the bureaucrats and the politicians as the small farm problem. How can we have a sensible agriculture with all these small farmers and get them out? And we know how they did that with the subsidy system. It was designed to get rid of small farmers. And that's what we've got in return. And I read something, the new Environment Minister was saying what a wonderful food and farming system we've got, because it produces. Did we know that food and drink is worth £108 billion to the British economy? Isn't that wonderful? And that's how it's measured. That's how success is measured. It doesn't matter that you're feeding a population with non-foods, where, if you were my age, you grew up with real foods. Now we're feeding with non-foods, but it doesn't matter because it makes profit for the food industry, which, for the food industry to be called a food industry is just nonsense. And that's a result of it. And now some positive stories. I'm sorry these are French. I would like that, but I'm not sorry in a way. I did a walking holiday in the Jura where we enjoyed Comté cheese. I expect some of you know Comté cheese, which seems to be an example of how food systems should work. They use that breed of mixed, it's a dual-purpose animal, the Montbéliard. They lay down very strict rules, so the pastures producing the milk for Comté cheese have to have all those plants in it that we saw in the earlier pictures. And if you go and sow a pasture there, you've got to include things like bird's foot trefoil and dandelion and plantain, all those deep-rooting herbs. That's part of the prescription for making this cheese. You can't feed your animals on any fermented products, so they can only get hay in winter from those same pastures. And the cheese is, I think it's a lovely cheese. It's unpasteurized, and everywhere you go in the Jura, whether it's a gourmet restaurant or a truck stop, you get offered Comté cheese. Everyone's very proud of it, and farmers are making money from it, and a food system which seems to be good for everybody. And that's a micro dairy, and that's Ben Mead and his wonderfully nourished cows gets turned into. And that's Mark McAfee in California, in Fresno, and he's got this system of grass-fed milk, cows out all year, and he's making a fortune selling his unpasteurized milk in California and around the States, and having running battles with the federal health authorities and the state health authorities who think what he's selling is poison, and it's just wonderful and people can't get enough of it. And that's somebody doing it in Nick Snellgar down in Hampshire. There's a great story of about a farmer inventor called Arthur Hosier, some of you may know of. And in the 1920s, when farmers were struggling with low prices, dairy farmers particularly were having a bad time, and some of them were going bust. Arthur Hosier came up with this idea that if you kept cows out on grass all the year round, they wouldn't get sick, they wouldn't get TB like most of the dairy herds would, and you would slash your costs, because most of the costs of dairy production came from keeping the cows in sheds, hauling the food to them, hauling the waste away. So all his neighbours thought he'd gone mad. He bought 1,000 acres of downland in Wiltshire. It was gorsy, scrubby, worked out downland. He put cows on it, and he milked them through this mobile parlour with a refrigeration unit, and he made lots of money. And in 1927, he'd been doing it 5 years, he presented his results to the Farmers Club in London, and he had sitting beside him the medical officer of health for Wiltshire who'd monitored this milk right through, and he said, this is the purest, cleanest milk in Britain. And it was so good, some of it got shipped up to London to people in hospital with immunodeficient conditions, and they could tolerate this unpasteurized milk from grass-fed cows. And that system, there's A.G. Street, who was a very famous writer around wartime, he switched to this system, as many farmers did at that time, because it seemed like the way ahead. It was low cost, produced very good food. And in his book, Farmer's Glory, which was a kind of farming classic, A.G. Street wrote that that's what saved his farm, that there was no money in wheat as he'd been growing. So he said he made himself a slave to the bottles because he was delivering the milk around Wilton and Salisbury, but it saved his farm. And hundreds of farmers at that very lean time switched to this system, and yet it's that's another thing that's been airbrushed from history. And I discovered, I put this down to two things. One, the Milk Marketing Board came along and guaranteed a price for farmers, so it didn't need to innovate anymore, they weren't struggling enough. And the second thing was, what was the second thing? The big dairies. Actually, Arthur Hosier in the end sold out to Express Dairies, and Express Dairies realized there was a lot of dirty milk at the time, particularly town milk, and there was a lot of sickness caused by this milk. And Express Dairies was lobbying the government hard to make pasteurization of milk compulsory, and you had to by law. And they got their way, which actually meant that the wealth from milk left the farmer, because if farmers like A.G. Street could sell their milk direct and unpasteurized, they had the power to go and set up milk runs. Express Dairies convinced the government that there was no good unpasteurized milk, and that was the end of the system. And the dairy industry took the wealth of dairy farming, and we see where the dairy industry has led dairy farming to what we've got today. Nick Snellgar produces, he's got a microherd in Hampshire. 2 years ago, he started marketing this milk from his microherd with very nice labels saying fair and local. He's selling it into shops at 95 pence a litre. He's selling it on the doorstep for £1.25 a litre, and he's making good money from it. And he's actually done all the costings, and he pasteurizes the milk. He doesn't sell it unpasteurized. But even he's doing so well at it, he can buy milk from his neighbour and pay his neighbour 40 pence a litre and still make a lot of money from pasteurizing it and selling it through his. And it gives the lie to those who say, well, public will always buy the cheapest, because none of his customers have dropped out in 2 years. That's both shops and households. So there are a lot of people who want real foods. And if I were a young guy, I'd go into milk and do it that way, because I just think there's huge opportunities for young people now. In my village, on Exmoor, and if you went back 50 years, it would all be grassland. It wasn't all grassland. In some of the valleys, they grew some cereals for feeding to their cattle, and they grew some root crops. But generally, all the steep slopes were under grassland. That mixed species grassland, they were grazed in the way I said. Now the export is being rapidly destocked because farmers can't make any money out of livestock. More and more of them going to growing arable crops, and that's a result of it. You get rain, that's in the middle of summer, and that's the colour of the rain as it runs down through the village because the soils are red and they're just disappearing. And they all go into the River Tone as it runs through Taunton, and that joins the River Parrett, and it all gets deposited in the Somerset levels, and then there's a great row because the Somerset levels flood. And it all starts on the farms in the hinterland. And that's Tom Chapman. That's a dairy farmer, an anonymous dairy farmer in Devon, who refused to let me photograph his face. He grew that grass crop. It was at the end of a very long, cold, dry winter. And he had a grass crop like that when all his neighbours were bare. And he did that because for the last 2 years he'd been using compost tea. And he was so embarrassed his neighbours would find out that he wasn't using. He said they wouldn't believe he hadn't used nitrogen on that crop. So I can't tell you who he is, so I'm sworn to secrecy. Animal welfare, that's our view of animal welfare today, and that's our view of animal welfare. And I guess this is almost the time to wind up. I'll just tell you a little story about that. That's at Wildlife Reserve in North Somerset, actually. But more recently, I've been on a nature reserve in Worcestershire. And this was an extraordinary place. It's, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's one of the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust reserves. And it's a bit of a small field system which has got the most amazing collection of diverse pasture species. And it's one of the best in Britain. And there's very little of this species-rich grassland left. And I walked around it with Rob Havard, who's an ecologist as well as a farmer. And it just struck me, I must be very dense, because it hadn't struck me before then, that this was an ancient field system which had originally come from forest. It was part of Feckenham Forest, which is in Worcestershire, and it was a royal hunting forest from Norman times till the forest law ended, I think, in the 17th century. And then the trees were slowly felled and farming encroached on this forest land. And it was kind of a wood, for centuries, it became a sort of wood pasture situation. And this collection of fields that was now this magnificent species-rich grassland, you could see some of it had been ploughed because it was ridge and furrow, and some of it, there was still a few cider apple trees there, so some of it had been orchard, and yet all of it had this amazing richness of plant species. And it occurred to me, and I couldn't think why. And then I kind of realised that, if you went back 300 or 400 years, those people wouldn't have been interested in growing, wonderful wildflower reserves. They actually were producing what they knew to be good food in ways that would go on year after year, decade after decade. So that's, and they got all this beautiful biodiversity and wildlife as a byproduct. And we know how to do that now, and it's just so frustrating that we don't. And that's me with Eddie Grundy and Rob Titchener. And I will, and a lighter moment. And I'd say a little word about the Archers, which started in 1950, which is an extraordinary example of storytelling, I guess. It came from the BBC in the 1940s, and a producer called Godfrey Baisley, who was a producer of farming programs and gardening programs in the Midlands. And he used to do all these worthy programs and bring farmers together, and they used to talk to people from the Ministry of Agriculture, and nobody ever listened, and farmers weren't interested in this stuff. They'd had enough directions during the war. And so one of Godfrey's meetings, a farmer stood up and said, what we need is a farming Dick Barton. Well, Dick Barton was a drama series that the BBC ran in the 1940s, and it was kind of an early forerunner of James Bond, just 50-minute with a cliffhanger at the end of it. So that's where the Archers came out, and it started, it started as a regional programme in the Midlands in 1950. Then January the 1st, 1951, it went national on the light programme, as it was then, and it was such a phenomenon. And within about 3 or 4 years, they had 15 million listeners. And everyone was totally caught up in this drama about basically farming people, a farming community. So I just want to leave with the idea that we cannot be inward looking. We actually have to tell the world about what their heritage is. You know, we're all entitled to that part of that food heritage. And farming doesn't belong to DEFRA, it doesn't belong to farmers even, it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to everybody. And the fact that everyone's disconnected with it is a total tragedy. And I think we have the stories which are powerful enough to change that. And I think we all together as team humanity should engage in getting those stories out. Now, I'd like to finish, if I may. I'd like to show just a 10-minute film I've just made recently with Tim May. Some of you will know Tim May, I guess. He's fairly large-scale, or was arable farmer in Hampshire, who took over the family farm a few years ago and has now gone over to a kind of modern mixed farming system, really. Anyway, he's taken half his land and put it into herbal lays. He brought livestock back for the first time in about 15 years. And this is, I made a film with him 4 years ago, just saying what his plans were. I've been back this year and done a sort of 10-minute film, which is updating it. And I think it's a very inspirational story, thanks to Tim.